Welcome to the library's tutorial on plagiarism and how to avoid that. Plagiarism comes from the Latin word plagiarius, which means kidnapper, that is, taking something that doesn't belong to you. In this case, rather than taking someone's child or pet, plagiarism means using someone else's words or ideas and presenting them as your own. It is a form of academic cheating. It's also a form of academic stealing. Plagiarism is considered a cardinal sin of scholarship. Trinity takes plagiarism so seriously that this is the quote from the TED's handbook. A student found to break the standard of academic integrity by plagiarism will be confronted by the faculty member involved and will be reported to the dean of students. This will result in a 0 grade for that particular paper, which may result in an F for the course depending on the weight of that assignment. Such an assignment cannot be made up or a substitute assignment made. It may also lead to expulsion from the institution or revocation of a degree already granted by Trinity. So we see the consequences are pretty severe. You could fail the paper, or you would fail the paper. You could fail the class. You could be kicked out of the school. Or if you had already graduated, and it turns out later we find out you plagiarized, we could just take your degree away from you. It would just be as if you never went here. Given that plagiarism is so serious, how can we avoid it? Well, the first is knowing that plagiarism can be intentional or unintentional. As it sounds, intentional plagiarism means willfully and knowingly using someone else's words or ideas and presenting them as your own. It can mean attempting to pass off someone else's entire paper as one's own, or just passing off intentionally other people's words or ideas and trying to get credit for them as your own. But most plagiarism at TEDS is unintentional. That is, the student doesn't mean to plagiarize, they just don't know how to avoid it. Unintentional plagiarism arises from two common errors. The first is failing to remember to place quotation marks around a quote, or failing to block the quote. This is plagiarism even if one cites the reference. So if you use somebody else's words, even if you put a footnote in to say where those words come from, if you do not place those particular words in quotation marks or put them in the form of a block quote, even if you cite the reference, it's still plagiarism. And that is because when you turn in a paper, every phrase, sentence, paragraph in your paper that is not either in quotation marks or set in a block quote, you are saying, these are my words. So if you use somebody else's words and don't put them in the form of a quote, it's still plagiarism, even if you include a footnote and say where it comes from. And the second error is paraphrasing too closely. This is plagiarism even if one cites the reference. So paraphrasing means changing the original quote slightly by changing certain keywords. And that is in the sense of how much can I change this or how little can I change this to where it's no longer the original author's words, but they're just mine now. So paraphrasing is just very dangerous. And if you quote the thing or if you paraphrase it too closely where it's obvious that that phrase or that sentence or that paragraph comes from an original source, even if you cite it, it's still considered plagiarism. So how do you avoid direct plagiarism of words? Simple. Always remember to place direct quotes in either quotation marks or set them in the form of a block quote. So this is avoided most by, as you're taking your notes, as you're reading through these articles and books, be very careful to keep separate your direct quotes from a source and your own notes, that is, your summaries and thoughts, etc. So when you write something down from a book, if it's a quote, if it's direct quote from that author, make sure to put in your notes quotation marks around it so that as you come back ready to write your paper, you know that those words come directly from one of your sources. So how do you avoid indirect plagiarism of words? And this is, as we said before, when you move from a summary of a person's words to a paraphrase of that person's words, that can lead to indirect plagiarism. What's the difference between a summary and a paraphrase? Well, a summary is written in your own words, while a paraphrase involves merely changing certain words in the source. So as you're reading an article or a chapter of a book, when you write down what that author is saying, if you write it in your own word, that's a summary, and that's perfectly acceptable to use. You'll still need to cite it, but you can do that as long as it's in your own words without using quotation marks. But if you paraphrase, and that is just changing certain words in the source, that will be considered indirect plagiarism. So the trick here is just avoiding all paraphrasing. Use only direct quotes, that is, what the author actually says in quotation marks or block quote, or summarize what the author says in your own words. And remember that even when summarizing in your own words, you still need to cite the original source, because that's the idea of plagiarizing ideas. If you use someone else's idea, you must cite the source even if you do not use that person's words. So what if you independently come up with an idea, but later find the same idea in a source? If you don't include the source that you found later in your research, you run the risk of being accused of plagiarism even though you independently came up with the idea on your own. So in this case, perhaps it's better to cite the source, and you could include a comment in your footnote that you came up with this idea on your own, but you later found it in your reading. Because if you fail to cite the source, even if you independently came up with the idea, you risk the charge of plagiarism, because your professor may well be aware that that idea originated before you in a particular author's works. Remember, scholarship involves building on the works of others. No scholar works independently of other scholars. If you look at a published article or a book, a scholarly article or scholarly book, you'll see that those are replete with quotes and references to other works that came before them. And this is perfectly fine and expected. You'll use other people's words and ideas. You just simply have to give proper credit where credit is due. So how do you check your paper for plagiarism before you turn it in? Well, Trinity provides access to the Turnitin software. And what Turnitin is going to do, you'll upload your paper to Turnitin. Turnitin will scan it, check it for what it thinks may be plagiarism, and then give you back a report on your paper with those parts highlighted and places noted where Turnitin suspects you might have plagiarized. So you can check this. Oftentimes those will be kind of false flags because Turnitin thinks this might come from another source, but perhaps it doesn't. So where do you access Turnitin? If you log into My Trinity and then come down to Academics and then go into TED's Academics and then come down to Thesis Guide, Writing Thesis Helps, and then click on Academic Integrity, then there's a link here to the Turnitin software, and then there's a link here to My Trinity Resources Plagiarism Prevention, and then there will be a place here to click in to log in with your Trinity login and password, the Moodle password that you're used to using for that, and mail, and the one that you use to log into My Trinity, in fact. So here you can log in to Turnitin, upload your paper, and check it for any kind of possible plagiarism. Remember that not only do you have access to turn your paper in to turn it in to check, but your professors also can turn your paper in to turn it in if they suspect plagiarism might have occurred. So this concludes our tutorial on plagiarism, what it is, and how to avoid it. And we hope that you found this helpful. And remember that plagiarism is taken very seriously at Trinity, but it can be avoided if you simply understand what it is and how to use your sources properly.